I'd told myself for 3 years that a man could get by just fine on work and silence, and then a half-broken woman came down off the ridge trail in the dark and rode straight through that notion without slowing. I heard the horse before I saw her, winded, stumbling, blowing hard enough to carry on the wind clear to my porch. By the time I had the lamp lit and the door open, the animal had stopped on its own at my hitching post, and the rider slid out of the saddle like a sack of grain and went down hard in the dirt. I caught her before her head struck the rail. In the lamplight she wasn't much past 25, dust ground into a tear at her shoulder, a bruise coming up along her jaw, her hands locked so hard around the reins I had to work her fingers loose one at a time. "You're on Whitfield land," I told her, though she couldn't hear a word of it. "You're safe now." She'd fainted dead away. I carried her inside, laid her on the cot by the stove, and sat up the rest of that night with my rifle across my knees, listening for riders that never came. I want to say I did it out of plain decency and nothing more. That would have been the truth 3 years before. But 3 years before, I still had a brother to come home to, and a woman in town who'd once told me she meant to marry me, before she found a bigger spread to set her sights on after Asa died and I went quiet. A man learns to keep his door shut after enough has walked out of it. I told myself that night I was only minding a stranger until she was fit to ride on. I half believed it. She woke near dawn asking for water in a voice scraped thin from a long ride and not enough sleep before it. I gave her the dipper and didn't press her with questions until she'd had 3 swallows. "May Hartwell," she said finally, like the name cost her something to give up. "My father kept a place 20 miles east, on Cutback Creek. He died in January. Pneumonia. And the bruise. The horse." She said it too fast, and I let it lie, because a woman who rides half the night alone in the cold isn't running from a horse. The rest came out in pieces over the next 2 days, the way truth does from someone who's learned the hard way not to trust easy. Otis Garrick ran the spread bordering her father's land and had wanted it for the better part of a decade. A week after the burial, he'd ridden over with a paper bearing what he swore was Joseph Hartwell's own signature, claiming 6 years of unpaid grazing debt, more than the land itself was worth on a good year. He'd offered her a way clear of it, generous as he must have thought himself, marry his son Roy before the month was out, and the debt would vanish like it had never been written. I told him I'd sooner lose the land, she said, sitting up now, color coming back into her face, stubborn as anything I'd run across in a long while. He told me I didn't have a say in the matter anymore. So I left before he could make that true. I should have ridden her straight to the sheriff in Granite Hollow and washed my hands of another man's trouble. That's what a sensible man does. Instead I found myself splitting an extra share of firewood that evening for no good reason I wanted to look at too closely, and telling her, gruffer than I meant to, that her ankle had swollen up like a melon and she wasn't fit to go anywhere for a few days, and that was the end of the discussion as far as I was concerned. She didn't argue the point. She also didn't sit still for it. By the second morning she'd found my mending basket and was patching a shirt I'd been wearing with a hole in the elbow for the better part of a year, working the needle like she'd done it her whole life, which, I came to learn, she had, keeping a household and a sick father both on her own for longer than any one person should have to. It was the third morning she found the boots by the door. They were Asa's, my younger brother's, oiled every spring since the stampede took him, set there like he might still walk in needing them. I hadn't told her about Asa. I hadn't told most people about Asa. "Whose are these?" she asked, not touching them, just looking. "My brother's. He's been gone 3 years. She didn't tell me she was sorry, which I appreciated more than I could have said at the time. She only nodded, like she understood a thing didn't always need fixing, only acknowledging, and went back to her mending. It was over breakfast that same morning she asked, careful, whether I'd lost my mother too. I told her my mother had gone when Asa and I were boys, and my father not long after, and that the two of us had run this place together until the stampede left just me running it alone. She set down her coffee and said her own mother had died birthing a brother who hadn't lived either, leaving just her and her father on the Cutback Creek place for the better part of 15 years. We sat with that a while, two people who'd each buried near everyone they had, and neither of us felt the need to fill the quiet with anything more than it already held. Something in my chest loosened that hadn't loosened in a long while. By the end of that first week she was walking without favoring the ankle, and I'd given up telling her not to help with the fence along the south pasture, because she held a post steadier than my hired man Cobb ever had. She talked to the horses low and steady, the way her father must have taught her. She squared her shoulders before saying anything hard. And she laughed, short and surprised, like she wasn't used to the sound coming out of her own throat. The evening my old dog stole her glove out of her coat pocket and refused to give it back for love or biscuit. I noticed all of it. I noticed I was noticing. One evening that week, with the wind picking up outside and Cobb already turned in, she sat across the fire from me mending a second shirt she hadn't been asked to touch and asked what my father had been like. I found myself telling her things I hadn't said aloud since the funeral, how he'd taught Asa and me to read brands at a gallop before either of us could write our own names, how he'd never once raised his voice in anger that I could recall, only in laughter. She told me her father had kept a Bible he never opened and a fiddle he played badly and often, and that she missed the bad fiddle more than she'd ever admit to a living soul. We sat there past the hour either of us meant to, the fire burning low, saying very little and meaning most of it. I knew trouble was riding our way before it arrived. 3 of Garrick's hands showed up at my northern boundary on the 8th day, polite enough on the surface, asking after a woman matching May's description who'd run off owing a debt to their employer. No woman's run off owing me anything, I told them, which was true enough to say without lying outright, since the debt wasn't hers to owe in the first place. You're on Whitfield land. I'd appreciate you turning around. They went. We both knew they'd be back, and that next time Otis Garrick wouldn't send hired hands to ask politely. That night I told May I was riding to Granite Hollow at first light, and she told me she was coming with me, in a tone that made plain it wasn't a question I'd be answering. I'd have argued it a week earlier. By then I'd learned better. We rode the 20 miles mostly quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. Somewhere past the halfway mark she asked if I figured Garrick would let it go easy once the forgery came to light. I told her men like Garrick never let go of anything easy, but the law had a way of making the choice for them. She rode a while longer before she said, low, that she hadn't expected a stranger to ride 20 miles over a debt that wasn't even owed to him. I told her it had stopped feeling like someone else's trouble a few days back. She didn't say anything to that, but she rode a little closer the rest of the way. Hiram Beck had kept every ledger in that county for 30 years and forgotten none of them. He didn't even need to check the book when I asked him, plain, whether Joseph Hartwell had ever carried a grazing debt to Otis Garrick. Joseph Hartwell paid his fees to the township every season for 15 years, I've got the receipts in this office to prove it, Hiram said, and pulled the ledger anyway. Beside it he said a letter Hartwell had written him the winter before he died, full of plans for spring planting, the handwriting plain and even. May's hand went to her mouth when she saw it, she hadn't laid eyes on anything of her father's writing since the burial. I held that letter beside Garrick's debt paper under the lamp. The signatures weren't written by the same hand. Not close, once you knew to look. Bring that paper of his to me, Hiram said, and I'll have the marshal at Garrick's door inside a week. I rode home with the letter folded inside my coat and a plan forming that had nothing gentle in it. Garrick didn't wait a week. He came himself, 3 days later, with Roy and 4 hands behind him, riding up to my porch like he owned the ground his horse stood on. I hear you've been harboring something of mine, he said. She's not yours to harbor or to take, I said. Not while I'm standing. And I've got a piece of paper that proves she never owed you a thing to begin with. Cobb came around the corner of the barn just then with his own rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm, saying nothing, just standing where Garrick's hands could count him. Nobody reached for anything. It was that kind of standoff, the kind settled with paper, not powder, if a man had the sense to let it be. I'd told May to stay inside. To her credit, she nearly did, made it as far as the doorway, which was as much obedience as I'd come to expect from her. I pulled Hartwell's letter from my coat and held it where Garrick could see the signature, then held his forged note up beside it. Hiram Beck's seen both of these, I said. So has the marshal, come Friday, unless you'd rather settle this here without him. Garrick's face did something ugly, then went still. A man who's built a scheme on a dead man's good name doesn't care to have that name produce its own evidence from the grave. He looked at his son, who had the decency to look like he'd rather be standing anywhere else on earth, and he looked at me, and I expect he did some quick figuring about what a forgery charge would cost him set against what one piece of grazing land was worth. I never wanted this, Roy said quietly, to no one in particular, and his father shot him a look that said he'd hear about it later. This isn't finished, Garrick said to me, because men like him always need the last word more than they need to be right. It is, I said. Get off my land. He went, and Roy went with him without looking back, and I never did hear that Otis Garrick troubled anyone in that county again. Word travels fast about a man caught forging a dead man's signature, faster still about one who got run clean off a ranch by a rifle he never even had cause to raise. May came out onto the porch once the dust had settled and stood beside me a long minute without saying anything. "You didn't have to do any of that," she said finally. "I know. Why did you?" I thought about Ace's boots by the door, oiled every spring for a man who wasn't coming home to wear them. I thought about 3 years of telling myself silence was enough to live on. I thought about a woman who'd ridden half the night through the cold rather than let another man decide the whole shape of her life, and who'd mended my shirt and laughed at my dog and never once asked me for more than a few days' shelter. "Because I had something left to give," I said, "and you were the first thing in 3 years I wanted to give it to." She didn't answer that with words. She put her hand in mine instead, out there on the porch with the dust still settling over the road, and that was answer enough for both of us. We married that October in Granite Hollow, with Hiram Beck standing witness and grinning the whole ceremony like he'd had a hand in it himself, which I suppose in a fashion he had. May kept her father's land and worked it alongside mine, and some mornings I'll catch her down by Cutback Creek at first light, just standing there the way her father must have once stood, like she's telling him something he'd be glad to hear. I bought a fiddle off a peddler that winter and learned to play it about as poorly as her father ever had, by her own account, and she swears she's never heard sweeter playing in her life. I doubt that's true. I don't doubt she means it. I still keep Ace's boots by the door. But there's a second pair beside them now, worn soft at the heel, and most evenings when I come in off the range, I find both pairs kicked off careless at the threshold, hers and mine, side by side, like two people who'd finally stopped expecting they'd need to run from anything again.